Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating analysis of the 1962 India-China War. And we're not just dusting off an old history book here. We're going to explore a highly complex historical timeline and dive into the modern geopolitical critiques presented in our source material. We'll trace the whole journey, from the really high hopes of early peace treaties straight into the devastating reality of the conflict itself. And then we'll look at how this history casts a long, complicated shadow over the political rhetoric we hear today. It's a gripping story of strategy, major miscalculations, and the harsh, unforgiving realities of international borders.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll kick things off with the initial peace agreements, follow the timeline through the fall of Tibet, and unpack the outbreak of the war. After that, we'll dig into the strategic missteps of the era, and finally, contrast all of that history with the realities of modern geopolitics. Let's get into it.
We're starting our chronological journey right in the middle of the 1950s, a time when hopes for peace were incredibly high.
To really understand the crushing defeat of 1962, the source asks us to look back at the very foundation of Sino-Indian relations under then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. Remember, India had recently gained independence. Its main focus was securing its borders, especially that massive, vulnerable stretch shared with Tibet and China. So the big question is, how on earth did a nation trying so hard for peaceful coexistence end up getting caught completely off guard?
Well, that brings us to the Panchsheel Agreement of 1954. It was basically designed as a diplomatic shield. Prime Minister Nehru actually foresaw the possibility of a Chinese takeover of Tibet, which, would bring Chinese forces right to India's doorstep. So Panchsheel was intended to secure those borders and build a solid framework of trust and mutual non-aggression between these two massive newly formed republics. And on paper, these 5 principles look like the absolute perfect recipe for lasting peace. We're talking mutual respect for territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, non-interference in internal affairs, equality, and peaceful coexistence. Sounds great, right? But the analysis points out a critical flaw in how this played out in reality. While India strictly stuck to the non-interference in internal affairs clause, China actively exploited it. They basically used India's diplomatic silence as a cover for their own expansionist goals.
Which brings us to a really crucial detail, the number 6. Prime Minister Nehru actually wanted a robust 20-year peace pact to guarantee long-term stability in the region. But China strategically negotiated that down. They only agreed to a 6-year term covering 1954 to 1960. The source argues this wasn't just some minor administrative detail, it was a highly calculated timeline that perfectly aligned with China's broader regional ambitions.
Let's look at the next phase and see exactly how that timeline set the stage for a massive geopolitical turning point.
Check out how these events slot perfectly into that 6-year window. The pact gets signed in 1954. Fast forward to 1959, while the treaty is technically still active, and China annexes Tibet. Because India was bound by that non-interference clause we talked about, they basically watched passively. It was during all this turmoil that the Dalai Lama fled to India for sanctuary. Then, exactly as scheduled in 1960, the treaty expires. Suddenly, India is looking at a completely transformed, heavily militarized border. So the peace treaty expires, the geopolitical buffer of Tibet vanishes, and the inevitable clash becomes reality. The analysis notes that shortly after Panchsheel ended, China launched a massive, highly coordinated attack on India. Despite India's continued peaceful posture and their reliance on diplomatic goodwill, Chinese forces completely overwhelmed the border. They ultimately captured the Aksai-Chin region, effectively taking about 10% of the disputed territory. It was this rapid, devastating military maneuver that caught the Indian establishment entirely unprepared. You can imagine the psychological shock here. Back in the 1950s, there was this incredibly popular, hopeful slogan, Hindi Chini Bye Bye, which roughly translates to Indians and Chinese are brothers. But that whole sentiment, which was built squarely on the Panchsheel Agreement, was absolutely shattered by the 1962 invasion. The illusion of fraternal peace just evaporated overnight.
So, how did things go so wrong? The source material offers a pretty heavy critique of the Indian leadership at the time, pointing to some major strategic blunders.
Let's break down those specific missteps. The analysis zeroes in on 3 main figures. First, Prime Minister Nehru for making tactical errors and totally misjudging the threat level. Second, Defense Minister V.K. Krishna Menon, whom the source describes as a highly problematic figure during the whole crisis. And third, General B.M. Kaul.
The really glaring issue highlighted here is that General Cao's primary background was actually in logistics and ration supply, yet he was inappropriately placed in a high-level combat command role despite lacking the necessary battlefield experience for it. Digging into the specific tactical errors, the source points out a major blunder right before the war actually kicked off. While visiting Nepal, Prime Minister Nehru boldly told the media that he had ordered the Indian army to engage and push Chinese forces out if necessary. The critique here is that this was a premature, really threatening statement. It unnecessarily provoked China and escalated tensions way before the Indian military was actually prepared or positioned to fight.
Furthermore, the source argues that a massive tactical advantage was just left on the table. During the conflict, Nehru hesitated to use the Indian Air Force for bombing or air support because he feared it would escalate things into a broader, uncontrollable war. But here's the catch. In 1962, China's air capabilities in that specific region were actually quite weak. So, by withholding its air power, the analysis argues India missed a crucial tactical advantage that could have drastically altered the outcome on the ground.
Now, let's fast forward a bit. The source shifts from the history of 1962 to offer a sharp critique of modern geopolitics.
The analysis draws a really stark contrast in how border issues are handled today. It observes that the modern Indian political establishment frequently uses aggressive, highly publicized rhetoric when it comes to Pakistan, often, the source claims, utilizing it for domestic political gain. But when it comes to dealing with China, the source points out a conspicuous relative silence from those exact same political figures.
To back this up, the source points to ongoing, modern-day incursions. We're talking about China making outright claims over Indian territory in Arunachal Pradesh, or those intense military standoffs in areas like Doklam. The analysis notes that despite these clear provocations, they received surprisingly muted political responses, especially when you compare it to the outrage generated by conflicts on India's western border.
The source also highlights a profound cultural irony surrounding Kailash Mansarovar. Now, this is an incredibly sacred site in Hinduism, viewed by millions as a spiritual epicenter. Yet, because of the historical events we just walked through, specifically the fall of Tibet, it remains entirely under Chinese control. And the source points out the glaring lack of political uproar or public outrage in India over a foreign power controlling such a foundational religious landmark.
Which brings us to our conclusion. We'll leave you with this final, genuinely provocative thought experiment posed by the source. If Kailash Mansarovar were located in Lahore, Pakistan, instead of Chinese-controlled Tibet, would the political silence remain the same? It's a question that really challenges us to reflect on how political priorities, historical memory, and perceived risks shape our view of national borders today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the narratives, and we'll see you next time.